Berlin, November 1943. The lights burn dim in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. A teleprinter stutters. Pages stack. Pages of numbers from the Atlantic, from the Pacific, from intelligence stations that no longer believe what they report. A general stands alone. He reads. He reads again. His coffee grows cold. The clock ticks past midnight. Outside, sirens wail. Inside, the maps remain spread on oak tables. Red pins mark victories, blue pins mark fronts. But it is the numbers on thin paper that tell the real story. They thought they had understood the war. But what they saw changed everything. The room smells of smoke and stale air. Footsteps echo in corridors where generals no longer speak with confidence. The marble floors remember different times. Times of triumph. Times when every calculation seemed to work. Now the atmosphere has shifted. Something fundamental. Something that cannot be named, but is felt in every briefing. The war planners gather at dawn. They bring reports from U-boat commanders in the Atlantic, from Luftwaffe reconnaissance over England, from agents still operating in neutral territories. Each document adds another piece to a puzzle that refuses to make sense. A map of Europe hangs on the eastern wall, a map of the Pacific on the western. Between them, a smaller map of the United States. Untouched, unreachable. 3,000 miles of ocean in each direction. Someone mentions the production figures from Detroit. Another speaks of shipyards in California. The words hang in the air like accusations. In early 1943, the logic seemed sound. The calculations were clear. The Americans had chosen their theater. After Pearl Harbor, they would pour everything into the Pacific. They would seek revenge against Japan. This would weaken their commitment to Europe. It had to. The strategic assessments reached Hitler's desk with confidence. America was fighting a naval war across the largest ocean on Earth. They were building carriers. They were island hopping. They were engaging Japanese forces from the Solomons to the Aleutians. This required ships, planes, men, resources that could not simultaneously flow to Britain. The OKW analysis predicted strain, predicted choices, predicted that Roosevelt would have to slow the buildup in England while MacArthur consumed supplies in the Pacific. This was not wishful thinking. This was mathematics. Industrial capacity had limits. Even American industrial capacity. The Führer himself had dismissed Roosevelt's production targets as propaganda. In 1940, when the American president announced plans for 60,000 aircraft, Hitler laughed. His advisors calculated it was impossible. Göring reassured him that Americans could build good refrigerators, but proper warplanes required German engineering, German discipline. The numbers Roosevelt announced were dismissed as democratic theater, as speeches designed to boost morale rather than serious projections. German intelligence had reported accurately about America's industrial base before the war. But those reports had been filed away, forgotten, because they conflicted with what leaders wanted to believe. But beneath the triumph, the first cracks had already formed. The reports arrive in sequence, not all at once. That would have been merciful. Instead, they come piece by piece through autumn 1943, each one contradicting the models, each one impossible, each one verified. Atlantic convoy counts July 1943. Allied shipping tonnage exceeds all losses since 1939. Every vessel sunk by U-boats has been replaced. Picture an ocean carpeted with steel hulls stretching to both horizons. North African equipment inventories, American forces land with 1,200 tanks in a single operation. Not refurbished equipment from the last war. New production. Shermans rolling off assembly lines that did not exist 3 years earlier. Pacific Theater production rates. February to November 1943. United States launches 17 aircraft carriers. Picture a carrier launching every 3 weeks. Japan, fighting since 1937, has completed 6 in the same period. Aircraft production data 1943, American output. 85,000 military aircraft in 12 months. Enough planes to cover the sky from Hamburg to Munich. By comparison, Germany's total wartime production from 1939 to 1945, under 95,000 aircraft. Tank manufacturing reports 1943 alone, 29,000 American tanks. More than Germany produced in the entire war from 1939 to 1945. That number bears repeating. 1 year of American production exceeded 6 years of German production. A Sherman tank completed every 18 minutes. Artillery and ammunition. More than 250,000 artillery pieces produced by 1943. 2 billion rounds of ammunition. Numbers that stop meaning anything. Numbers that become abstractions. Shipyard intelligence Liberty ships completed in 45 days. Picture a merchant vessel the size of a city block, welded together in 6 weeks. Henry Kaiser's yards launching 3 ships a day at peak production. The bomber statistics. B-24 Liberator. 1 complete bomber every 63 minutes at Ford's Willow Run plant. Each aircraft containing 1.5 million parts. Each one rolling off the line faster than a complex automobile. Dual theater confirmation. This is the crucial data. The impossible data. American forces advancing in both Europe and the Pacific simultaneously. Both fronts receiving new equipment. Both fronts expanding. No slowdown detected. No resource diversion observed. The mathematical models break down. Every assumption proves false. The Americans are not choosing between theaters. They are supplying both, at increasing rates, while their own civilian economy continues functioning. Their citizens still have automobiles, still have consumer goods, still have food without rationing at German levels. The industrial base that was supposed to strain under 1 war effort is accelerating under 2. Production in 1943 exceeds production in 1942. Production in 1944 will exceed production in 1943. Intelligence officers check the numbers again. They must be wrong. They triple check. They send requests for verification. The answers return. The figures are accurate. If anything, they underestimate American capacity. Silence follows. And in that silence, truth becomes undeniable. General Alfred Jodl sits alone in his office. It is 4 a.m. He has not slept. On his desk lie 3 separate intelligence summaries. All reach the same conclusion from different angles. All converge on the same terrible arithmetic. He lights another cigarette. The smoke drifts toward the blackout curtains. Somewhere in the distance, he can hear anti-aircraft fire, practice drills, or perhaps another RAF raid. It no longer matters. The documents tell a story that should be impossible. America entered the war in December 1941, 24 months ago. In those 24 months, they have built more military equipment than Germany produced in 4 years of total war. And they show no signs of slowing down. He thinks of the briefings he gave, the confident assessments, the predictions that America would exhaust itself in the Pacific. The calculations showed it clearly. Industrial capacity was finite. Resources were finite. Men were finite. These were laws of economics, of physics, of war itself. But the Americans have rewritten the laws. Or perhaps they never read the German assessment of what was possible. They have built aircraft carriers while building bombers. They have supplied Britain while fighting Japan. They have maintained civilian production while arming the largest military force ever assembled. The numbers mock every strategic assumption, every logistical model, every calculation about the limits of industrial warfare. The Americans have not merely exceeded German production. They have exceeded it by orders of magnitude while fighting on two fronts separated by half the globe. Jodl understands what this means. He has always understood mathematics, logistics, supply chains. War is won by bullets before battles, by steel before soldiers, by production before planning. Germany committed everything to rearmament from 1933 onward. Every factory, every resource, every innovation. They achieved the most efficient war economy in Europe. They outproduced France. They outproduced Britain until late 1942. They pioneered synthetic fuel. They revolutionized tank production. They built the most advanced weapon systems in the world. And it means nothing. Because across the Atlantic sits a nation that can produce more in 18 months than Germany produced in a decade of preparation. A nation that does it almost casually. A nation that runs 3 shifts in factories that did not exist 3 years ago. A nation that converts automobile plants to tank production and somehow builds more tanks than Germany built automobiles. The map on the wall shows the fronts: east, west, south, Mediterranean, each front demanding men, equipment, supplies. And now they are learning that the Americans can supply all of them, simultaneously, while still building up forces for an invasion that everyone knows is coming, but no one can stop. He reads the final line of the intelligence summary again. American industrial output continues to accelerate. No signs of resource constraints detected. Dual theater operations sustainable indefinitely. Sustainable indefinitely. Those 2 words contain the entire truth. The war is lost, not because of any single battle, not because of any tactical error, but because the other side can simply outproduce every defeat, every loss, every defensive success. He knew it then. Not might be lost, was lost. The failure was not industrial. It was conceptual. Germany had optimized for European warfare. America had industrialized for continental economics. The difference was fatal. German war production was a masterpiece of efficiency. Albert Speer rationalized production, standardized components, eliminated waste. By 1943, Germany was producing more weapons per factory worker than any nation in Europe. The system worked brilliantly for its designed purpose. Maximum output from limited resources in a confined geographic area. But the American system operated on entirely different principles. Scale, abundance, redundancy. The Americans did not optimize for efficiency. They optimized for volume. They built excess capacity into every system. When one factory reached limits, they built another. When supplies tightened, they opened new sources. When manpower declined, they recruited from populations Germany could not imagine mobilizing. Women, who comprised 65% of aircraft industry workers by 1943. The geographic advantage proved insurmountable. Germany fought on ground that could be bombed. Factories could be destroyed. Supply lines could be cut. Infrastructure could be targeted. The Americans built their arsenal 3,000 miles from any possible enemy action. Every factory operated at full capacity every day without fear of attack. No evacuation, no dispersal, no hiding production underground. The resource base created unfair competition. Germany depended on conquered territories for oil, steel, labor. Supply lines stretched across hostile populations. Every occupied zone required garrison troops. Every captured factory operated at reduced efficiency. Meanwhile, American factories drew from internal resources: iron from Minnesota, oil from Texas, aluminum from Tennessee, rubber from synthetic plants using coal as feedstock. The Mississippi River carried resources more efficiently than the entire European rail network under constant partisan attack. The mobilization timing sealed the outcome. Germany had mobilized for war in the 1930s. They exhausted their advantages early, conquered France, conquered Poland, conquered most of Europe, then ran into Soviet depth and American production. The Americans mobilized last, but mobilized completely. They spent 18 months building the infrastructure of war before committing troops. When they finally engaged, they deployed mature industrial systems against exhausted opponents. The standardization philosophy created divergence. Germany built sophisticated weapons, each tank a masterpiece of engineering, each aircraft incorporating the latest innovations. This meant constant retooling, constant adjustment, incompatible parts. A tank destroyed in 1943 could not easily be repaired with parts from 1941 models. American weapons were simpler but interchangeable. A Sherman tank used standardized components. Any Sherman could be repaired with parts from any other Sherman. The logistics worked. The mathematics worked. The boring reliability worked better than sophisticated excellence. The labor force revealed the deepest advantage. Germany relied on slave labor, hostile workers in hostile territories producing weapons they hoped would fail. Quality suffered. Sabotage remained constant. Motivation was impossible. The Americans mobilized citizens who believed in victory, workers who wanted to win. The difference in productivity per worker was staggering. An American factory worker produced output equivalent to 3 German workers. Not because of superior skill, but because of superior commitment. The naval protection created the killing blow. Every ship of weapons sent to Europe arrived. Every convoy eventually landed. German U-boats exacted terrible costs, but never enough. The Americans built ships faster than submarines could sink them. By late 1943, the Atlantic belonged to Allied convoys. The Pacific belonged to American carriers. Both oceans served as supply routes instead of barriers. The mechanism was systemic, inevitable, irreversible. Once American industry fully engaged, only American exhaustion could stop it. And American exhaustion never came. The realization changed nothing immediately. The war continued for 18 more months. German forces fought with skill, with courage, with desperation. They held ground. They counterattacked. They inflicted casualties. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 showed that German operational art still functioned, that German soldiers still fought. But the numbers never changed. For every German tank destroyed, 3 American tanks replaced it. For every plane shot down, 5 more appeared. The mathematics remained implacable. Production determined outcomes more reliably than tactics. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate war. The German realization in 1943 foreshadowed the post-war order, a world where industrial capacity determined national power, where America's untouchable manufacturing base would define global politics for decades. The Cold War began in those autumn months when German generals finally understood that oceans were advantages, not obstacles. The historical irony cuts deeply. Germany pioneered modern industrial warfare. They understood logistics, supply chains, resource management. They wrote doctrine about economic warfare and total mobilization. But they lost to a nation that industrialized warfare beyond their conceptual framework. The Americans did not fight a more efficient war. They fought a bigger war, and bigger proved better. The lesson remained unlearned. In 1943, Hitler continued insisting on wonder weapons, on technological superiority, on fighting spirit. He never accepted that industrial wars are won by industrial powers, that production capacity matters more than tactical brilliance, that you cannot substitute sophistication for volume when the other side has both. For the generals in Berlin that November, the realization brought a kind of clarity. The end was visible. Not because they would run out of soldiers, not because they would run out of courage, but because they would run out of everything else while their enemies kept producing. The Americans would make mistakes, would suffer defeats, would waste resources. And none of it would matter because they could afford waste. They could afford mistakes. They could afford to learn slowly because they had time and material that Germany would never possess. The maps remained on the walls. The red pins still marked positions. The blue lines still showed fronts. But everyone who understood logistics knew the truth. The war was over. Only the fighting remained. In war, even perfect victories can seal your defeat. Germany had defeated France, had defeated Poland, had nearly defeated the Soviet Union. But in defeating everyone nearby, they had created the conditions that brought American industry into the war. And American industry, once awakened, could not be defeated by any force Germany could generate. Wars are not lost in battle, they are lost in decisions made long before. On the night of June 4th, 1944, the most powerful man in the Allied command sat alone in a cold room and could not decide whether to send 156,000 men to their possible deaths. The rain hammered against the windows of Southwick House. Inside, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stared at a map of the French coast. The English Channel was marked with arrows, landing zones, naval routes, drop points. Everything had been planned down to the minute. Everything except the weather. He lit another cigarette, his fourth in the last hour. Outside, the wind howled. Eisenhower was 53 years old. He had commanded men in North Africa, Sicily, Italy. But this was different. This was not a battle. This was the entire war, condensed into a single choice. Go or wait. Launch the invasion tomorrow into a storm that could sink half his fleet. Or delay and risk losing the element of surprise. Risk the collapse of morale among 156,000 men already packed into ships, seasick and terrified. He thought about the men. Farm kids from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, boys writing letters to their mothers, sealing them in envelopes marked, "In case I don't come back." The door opened behind him. His chief of staff stepped inside. Didn't say anything, just handed Eisenhower a folder. Inside was the latest weather report. Eisenhower opened it, read the first line, closed his eyes. The forecast was worse than before. He set the folder down beside the map, the cold coffee, the overflowing ashtray. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, "If I wait, I risk everything. If I go, I risk everything." The storm raged outside. The clock ticked, and somewhere in the darkness, history held its breath. Because the decision he was about to make would determine whether the Allies would liberate Europe, or whether thousands of young men would drown in the Channel before ever reaching the beach. He had made 1,000 decisions in this war, but none like this. To understand why this decision nearly broke him, you have to go back 18 months to the moment when the Allies decided to do something no army in history had ever attempted. Operation Overlord was the largest amphibious assault ever conceived. 156,000 men, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, all converging on a 50-mile stretch of French coastline in a single day. 5 beaches, paratroopers behind enemy lines, naval bombardment from the sea, bombers from the sky. On paper, it was perfect. But perfection required one thing the Allies could not control: the weather. The English Channel is unpredictable. Storms appear without warning. Tides shift violently. Winds turn calm seas into killing grounds in hours. And for Operation Overlord to work, the Allies needed 3 conditions to align simultaneously. A full moon, so paratroopers could see their drop zones. Low tide at dawn, so engineers could dismantle the obstacles the Germans had planted along the beaches. Calm seas and clear skies, so the fleet could land, and bombers could see their targets. All 3, at the same time. According to the astronomers and tide charts, that only happened on 3 days in June: the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. 3 days. That was the window. Miss it, and the Allies would have to wait another month. 30 more days of secrecy. 30 more days for German intelligence to discover the plan. 30 more days for Hitler to reinforce the Atlantic Wall. 30 more days for the invasion force, already loaded onto ships since June 1st, to lose their nerve. Because the men were already there. Thousands of young soldiers crammed into the holds of vessels that rocked in English harbors. Seasick, scared, clutching letters from home, sharpening bayonets, praying. They had been told June 5th was the day. And now, on the night of June 4th, as the rain hammered Southwick House and the wind howled through the rigging of 5,000 ships, Eisenhower faced a terrible arithmetic. If he launched the invasion into a storm, thousands would drown before ever firing a shot. Landing craft would capsize. Paratroopers would scatter across flooded fields. Bombers would drop payloads blind, killing their own men. But if he delayed, morale would shatter. Men would break. Secrets would leak. The Germans would be ready. Either way, men would die. The only question was how many. And standing between those 2 catastrophes was a man Eisenhower had never met until 3 weeks ago. A Scottish meteorologist named James Stagg. The man who was about to tell the most powerful generals in the world that they could not invade France. James Stagg was not a soldier. He had never fired a gun, never led men into battle, never stood on a beach under fire. He was a meteorologist, 43 years old, Scottish, serious, a scientist in a room full of generals who measured success in territory captured and enemies killed. Stagg measured success in atmospheric pressure and wind speed. And on the morning of June 4th, 1944, at 4:15 a.m., he walked into a room at Southwick House and told the most powerful military commanders in the world that they could not invade France. The room was small, a single table, a map of the English Channel pinned to the wall, another map covered with isobars and weather fronts. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, silent, smoking. To his left, Montgomery, commander of Allied ground forces, confident, impatient. To his right, Ramsey, naval commander, calm, calculating. Across from him, Lee Mallory, air commander, nervous, skeptical. They were all waiting for Stagg. He stepped to the front of the room. His hands were steady, but his voice was tight. "Gentlemen," he said, "I'm afraid the news is not good." He pointed to the map. A massive low-pressure system was moving in from the Atlantic, faster than predicted, stronger than expected. We're looking at winds of 25 to 30 miles per hour, waves of 4 to 6 feet, heavy cloud cover across the entire channel. Silence. Lee Mallory spoke first. "If we launch in this weather, we'll lose half our aircraft. The bombers won't be able to see their targets. I'm estimating 70% casualties among the airborne divisions." 70%. That meant out of every 10 paratroopers who jumped, 7 would die before reaching the ground. Ramsey leaned forward. "The Navy can handle rough seas. But if the waves are 6 feet, men will drown in their gear before they even see the sand." Montgomery slammed his hand on the table. "We can't delay. The men are ready. If we postpone now, morale will collapse." Eisenhower said nothing, just stared at the map. Stagg stood there, waiting. He knew what they wanted him to say. They wanted him to tell them the storm would pass, that maybe, just maybe, conditions would improve. But he couldn't, because the data didn't lie. "General," Stagg said quietly, "if you launch tomorrow, you'll be sending men into the worst weather the Channel has seen in 20 years. They won't survive it." The room went silent. Eisenhower looked up. His eyes were tired, bloodshot. He hadn't slept in 2 days. "What are the chances the forecast is wrong?" "Low, sir. Very low." Eisenhower nodded slowly. Then he turned to the others. "Gentlemen," he said, "we postpone. 24 hours. Lee Mallory exhaled. Ramsey nodded. Montgomery looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. Stagg felt the weight lift slightly from his chest, but only slightly, because he knew what no one else in that room was saying out loud. If the weather didn't improve in the next 24 hours, Operation Overlord would have to be postponed for a month. And if that happened, the invasion might never happen at all. Eisenhower stayed behind after the others left, alone, staring at the map. Stagg paused at the door. "Sir, I'll have another update for you tonight." Eisenhower didn't look up, just nodded. Stagg walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on stone. He had just delayed the largest military operation in history. And in 24 hours, he would have to walk back into that room and do it all over again. The postponement went into effect immediately. Radio operators sent coded messages to every ship in the harbor. Stand down. Delay 24 hours. New briefing 0400 tomorrow. But the men didn't know why. They had been packed into landing craft for 3 days. Sick, exhausted, ready to fight or die just to get it over with. And now they were being told to wait. Some threw up over the side of the ships. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. A few prayed. Most just tried not to think about what tomorrow might bring. Eisenhower didn't sleep that night. He paced his quarters at Southwick House, smoked cigarette after cigarette, drank cold coffee, stared at maps that no longer made sense because the one thing he couldn't control, the weather, had rendered them useless. At 2 a.m., he sat down at his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. He wrote slowly, carefully. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He dated it, July 5th. Then he folded the paper and put it in his pocket. It was a resignation letter, a confession, a pre-written eulogy for a disaster that hadn't happened yet. But he needed to write it, needed to know that if 156,000 men died because of his decision, he would take full responsibility. No excuses. No blaming the weather, the intelligence, the enemy. Just him. By dawn on June 5th, the wind had not stopped. The rain had not stopped. But something had changed. Stagg had been awake all night, monitoring reports from weather stations across the Atlantic, ships at sea, observation posts in Iceland, radio signals from Greenland. And buried in the data, he found something. A gap. A brief window of calmer weather. Not perfect. Not ideal. But survivable. It would arrive late on June 5th and last approximately 36 hours. Just enough. At 9:30 p.m. on June 5th, Stagg walked back into the briefing room at Southwick House. The same generals, the same table, the same map. But this time, the air was different, tighter, more desperate, because everyone in that room knew. If Stagg didn't have good news, Operation Overlord was over. Eisenhower looked up as Stagg entered. His eyes were hollow. He hadn't shaved, hadn't changed clothes. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 24 hours. "Well," Eisenhower said. Stagg stepped to the front, pointed to the updated weather map. "Gentlemen," he said, "there's a break in the weather, a window. It's not perfect, but it's enough." Silence. Then Lee Mallory leaned forward. "How long?" 36 hours, maybe less. And after that, the storm returns, worse than before. Montgomery spoke next. "If we go now, we go with what we have. No delays, no second chances." Ramsey nodded. "The Navy is ready." Lee Mallory hesitated. Then, "The Air Force will do its part." All eyes turned to Eisenhower. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the map, at the numbers, at the faces of the men around him. Then he stood, looked each of them in the eye, and said 5 words that would change the course of history. "Okay, let's go." 3 words. That's all it took. "Okay, let's go." But those 3 words carried the weight of 156,000 lives. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then the general stood, shook hands, nodded. They filed out one by one, returning to their commands to set the largest invasion in history into motion. Stagg lingered near the door. Eisenhower caught his eye. "Thank you," Eisenhower said quietly. Stagg nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. He had just given a green light to an invasion that could still fail, that could still cost tens of thousands of lives. But at least now, they had a chance. As the door closed, Eisenhower was alone again. He walked to the window. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The wind had dropped from a howl to a whisper. But it was still there, still dangerous. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper. The note he had written hours earlier, the one accepting full blame if the invasion failed. He read it again, every word, every line. "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He thought about the paratroopers who would jump tonight, the 101st and 82nd Airborne, boys from farms and factories who had never seen combat. They would leap into darkness over occupied France, not knowing if they would land in a field or a tree or a river, not knowing if German soldiers would be waiting. He thought about the men on the beaches, the first wave, the ones who would hit Omaha and Utah at dawn, running into machine gun fire, artillery, mines, the ones who would die in the surf before ever reaching the sand. He thought about the sailors who would steer landing craft through rough seas, knowing that one wave could capsize them, one mine could blow them apart. And he thought about the families back home, the mothers and fathers and wives and children who would open telegrams in a few days. Telegrams that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." All because of him. All because he had said 3 words. Eisenhower folded the note and put it back in his pocket. He would keep it there for the next 48 hours. A reminder, a promise to himself. If this failed, he would own it. Completely. No matter what anyone else said. But if it succeeded, he didn't let himself finish that thought. Because right now, success felt impossible. Right now, all he could think about were the boys who were about to board planes and ships and landing craft, heading toward a coastline bristling with German guns. Boys who trusted him to make the right call. Boys who would live or die based on whether a Scottish meteorologist's forecast was correct. At 11 p.m., Eisenhower left Southwick House and drove to the staging areas where the 101st Airborne was preparing to load onto C-47 transport planes. The paratroopers stood in groups, faces blackened with camouflage paint, weapons checked and rechecked. Some joked nervously, others were silent. Eisenhower walked among them, shook hands, looked them in the eyes. "Good luck," he told them. "The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." They nodded, smiled, saluted, and then they climbed into the planes. Eisenhower watched as the first aircraft roared down the runway and lifted into the night sky. Then another and another. Within an hour, over 13,000 paratroopers were airborne, flying toward Normandy. Eisenhower stood on the tarmac, hands in his pockets, watching until the last plane disappeared into the clouds. Then he turned and walked back to his car. There was nothing left to do now but wait and pray that he had made the right decision. By dawn on June 6, 1944, the first wave was hitting the beaches. Omaha was a bloodbath. Bodies in the surf, medics under fire, landing craft burning. But they held. Utah went better than expected. Paratroopers regrouped and seized key bridges. The British and Canadians pushed inland. By nightfall, 156,000 Allied soldiers had landed on French soil. Casualties were heavy, nearly 10,000 dead or wounded. But the foothold was secure. The invasion had succeeded. On June 7th, Eisenhower reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note, the one he had written 2 nights earlier, the one that began, "Our landings have failed." He looked at it for a long moment. Then he tore it up. He never had to send it, never had to stand before the world and accept blame for a disaster that didn't happen. But the fact that he wrote it, that he was prepared to take full responsibility, that's what made him a leader. Not the victory, not the medals, not the rank. The willingness to say, if this fails, it's mine alone. Eisenhower never blamed the weather, never blamed Stagg for the delay, never blamed Lee Mallory for his doubts. He made the call, and he was ready to own the consequences. That's leadership. On the night of June 4th, 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. He listened to the experts. He weighed the risks. And when the moment came, he said 3 words that changed history. "Okay, let's go." But before he did, he wrote a letter accepting full blame if it all went wrong. That note was never sent, but it should never be forgotten.